Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, part 16. In a way, the whole affair was to bring things to a head and changes were made. It had become apparent that there had been friction between Gallant and myself, and it seemed practical that I should be moved to No. 3 Squadron. That was alright by me. There's never been any doubt in my mind that Adolf Gallant and myself were cut from very different wood. In 3 Squadron, I felt at home straight away. After all, my great friend Hinak Waller was technical officer. Oberleutnant Helmut Kühle had been assigned to command, and even though he too was a Spaniard like Gallant and Ewald, he was a much more generous type. Another character, Oberleutnant Horst Tietzen, joined the squadron on a temporary basis, having only just returned from Spain with some 7 victories. He was a very likable man and was one of the few people I met in my military service who had the balance right between being friendly and approachable without compromising his military authority or his role as a leader. When it came to decide which of our 2 Oberleutnants would leave and which would remain in charge of the 3rd Squadron, I have to confess that we were disappointed when Horst left to take command of the 6th Squadron of Fighter Group 51. Helmut Kühle was a good leader and an exemplary officer, but he lacked the exceptional quality of Tietzen. We were sad when he left, and even sometime later during the Battle of Britain, I keenly felt his loss when he was killed on August the 18th. Whilst he was with us, I thought that Tietzen was the best consultant Hauptmann vom Pfeil had, and I think we might have made real progress had he stayed, but it was not to be. Kühle was supportive of my work as the NO, but Tietzen really worked at it. He was one who could see how valuable good radio communications would be. He was one of the few Spaniards who realized that wing signals and telephone briefings would soon be outpaced if we ever went to war with one of the major European powers. Although I actually had some help with my work now, there still didn't seem to be enough hours in the day. Only at the weekends we were free to go out and unwind. The Stefan family owned a weekend house on the Rauer Alp not far from Hornberg, the home of the free flight glider. We really had some good times at that little house, everyone including the girls playing soccer or just relaxing in the warm sunshine. Most times we drove there in a convoy of 3 cars, Mr. Stefan's big Mercedes 230 in front, my little DKW in the middle, and 4 pretty girls in a Mercedes Cabriolet bringing up the rear, together with its bold notice, Endlich allein, which means alone at last, which was draped across the boot of the car. They were good days, and in many ways I thought that I was leading a very satisfying and rewarding life. I felt very privileged on the whole, but deep down there was still some rancor. It is difficult to express exactly how I felt, and it is probably best illustrated by example. At Böblingen, we had Lieutenant Hans Bertel, who had been promoted from the ranks, having served as a flying instructor. He had been assigned to Ewald's No. 2 Squadron, where he was to stay. A few strings had been pulled here. He was exceptionally good at aerobatics, and everyone held him in high esteem, even the Spaniards. He was accepted at once and without any apparent reservation. I didn't really envy this. I too admired his skill and dedication to his art. Every morning he would be up in the sky practicing over Böblingen before the official day had begun, waking up those who hadn't realized the night was over. The 160 horsepower engine of his Bücker Jungmeister, which had been assigned to him for his personal use, became our reveille. His dedication was to pay off when he later finished in the top 5 of the National Aerobatic Championships. I wasn't envious of his success, but here to me was the tragic difference. He was a young man who was doing something he loved and which was for his own personal advancement and satisfaction. To this end, he had the full support of the group commander and the backing and admiration of the veterans. In stark contrast to this was my own position. My efforts had little or nothing to do with my own advancement, and I didn't particularly like what I was doing. It had taken me away from flying, it had caused some bad feelings between myself and many of the officers, and all I was doing was trying my hardest to get an aspect of the group's combat readiness in some kind of shape. But all that my dedication and hard work had ever done was cost me dearly. It seemed sometimes that things would always be an uphill fight for me, and I was never to have any really bad luck. After all, I survived the war when so many of my friends and colleagues perished, but I certainly didn't have much handed to me on a plate either. One thing which did break my way and helped to improve my status was when my father was recalled to service. He had been an officer in the First War with a horse-drawn heavy machine gun unit. He had maintained his love for horses after the war, and with the rearmament he was recalled, promoted, and given the chance to work with an artillery unit at Ludwigsburg. Now, father and son managed to arrange a deal that would further the understanding and cooperation between the artillery and the Luftwaffe. In short, he arranged for our officers to have first-class riding lessons, and we, in turn, arranged for artillery officers to have flights at Böblingen and some experience as pilots under instruction. It was an amicable arrangement and we all enjoyed the exchange of roles, but it was something which was to be short-lived, to be overtaken by other events. It was obvious from the growing hysteria in the press and the stirring broadcasts by Joseph Goebbels that things were once more coming to a head. Again, the storm clouds began to gather, and again we began to prepare in earnest for what might just be a few weeks away. It was the summer of 1939. In the newspapers and on the radio there were constant reports of saber-rattling going on between Germany and her neighbors. Several incursions into the myriad and pernicious clauses of the Versailles Diktat had been made, and each had carried with it the threat of war against Germany. None of these had come to anything, but we had almost become accustomed to living in a state of readiness. Since the Czech so-called crisis, things had settled down for a short time and we were able to take stock. The training of my Nachrichtenzug was now coming along well, we had most of the equipment we needed and the personnel were now really finding their feet. Unteroffizier Krehe, my valuable training NCO and jack of all trades, was my right-hand man and I recommended his promotion to Feldwebel, but even that took time. The Nachrichtenzug now began to appreciate that there were some advantages to their work, one of which was to get out on field exercises. Now that we were actually beginning to operate like a professional unit and also starting to use our more powerful equipment, we had to get away from Böblingen because of the interference with the Lufthansa radio, our 1.5 kilowatt transmitters on other frequencies blotting them out. So we spent a lot of the summer in the beautiful countryside around Stuttgart and in the Schwarzwald, which is the Black Forest, setting up the equipment and carrying out training. That was a lot better than being confined to the base where discipline was high and behavior very formal. One of the key operations of the Nachrichtenzug was its ability to set up communications at a new location while still maintaining cover at the old base. This is why most of the equipment and, to a lesser extent, the personnel were duplicated. To test this function, I would arrange exercises where the mobile unit would move out to another location and set up ready to take communications traffic. One of the first of these exercises took the unit out to the Wolfhirt glider field at Nabend near Kirchheim unter Teck. By noon, they called to inform me that all was ready and I flew out in the 109 to test the communications. I couldn't land, the ground personnel had advised that the field was too soft, but I made several low and high passes to test the quality of the transmissions. The range and quality varied tremendously according to the density of the cloud and height, sometimes it would fade off completely. This was something we would have to improve if we were to provide the communications cover that we had promised and which I had so avidly sold to the squadron leaders. In the afternoon I returned in more sedate transport, the Focke-Wulf Stößer. Being lighter and with a very much lower landing speed, I was given permission to make a landing. Apparently, my men were very proud when their flying lieutenant arrived, proving to the local farmers that they were in fact part of the Luftwaffe. Initially I was pleased with the setup at Nabend, but became a little concerned when it became obvious that the now suitable impressed farmers were being more than generous with a supply of homemade cider for the Fliegersoldaten. The drive back, according to Unteroffizier Krehe, was something of a wild affair and we were lucky that there weren't any serious consequences. Later, I cautioned the NCOs that if they wanted to continue the degree of trust and freedom which they presently enjoyed, then they would have to keep a tighter rein on the charges in the field. But with the best will in the world, accidents happen when you least expect them. To gradually develop the capability of the unit, it required steadily more complex exercises, leading ultimately to their being able to fulfill their role. For us, the next stage was to set up a full communications unit at a new Feldflugplatz, and for this exercise we went to a large meadow near the old castle Monrepos, about 5 kilometers from my parents' home at Reutigheim. We were to install everything that would be needed by a Gruppe operating in the field. It had been difficult to secure the location, but in this case I was able to get my father to pull the appropriate strings. Such an exercise normally took a whole day, with us leaving early in the morning and sometimes not returning until dawn of the next day. It was quite something for a young lieutenant, I was still only 20, to have virtually independent command of a mobile unit like this, and I was rather proud of our performance. With all of the vehicles for the mobile unit on the road, we looked quite something. There were motorbikes, 2 Kübelwagen, my BMW staff car and 2 light and 2 heavy trucks, which was my private army. This wasn't the first time that we'd set up the full field unit and the troops were getting used to an efficient routine. At about 5 p.m. we were finished at Monrepos and I was driven back to Böblingen by Gefreiter Meyer in one of the Kübelwagen. Our regulations were that only squadron leaders and senior ranks could drive themselves, all other officers had to have a driver. This was probably done to prevent the younger officers appropriating official vehicles for private use. By 6 p.m, we were nearly back at Böblingen, driving on a good road and in good light, when I saw a motorcyclist ahead of us, riding in the middle of our side of the road. We seemed to be closing on him fast, and there didn't seem to be any sign from Meyer that he'd seen the motorcycle. I glanced at him and saw that he was having a 1,000-yard stare. He hadn't seen the motorbike at all. I shouted and grabbed the handbrake, causing the jeep to swerve, but it was too late. We hit the back of the bike, catching it between the radiator and the near side front wheel. The unfortunate rider had no chance at all, the Kübelwagens were very sturdy vehicles, and we slewed into a milestone, crushing him between the stone and front of the unyielding vehicle. The stone was uprooted, and the whole sorry mess, rider, bike, Kübelwagen and us, crashed down the embankment on the road to lodge in a hedge. As we jumped from the vehicle, I shouted to Meyer, "What the hell did you do?" He stared back at me in shock, not knowing what had happened at all. I told him we'd hit a motorbike, and at that moment we both saw the man lying by the front of the vehicle. It seemed up to that point Meyer had really been completely detached from reality. We reached the rider, who had been thrown clear, and saw that he'd obviously been severely injured around the hip and the lower abdomen, clearly an emergency case. We were still outside the town, so I flagged down a car and we moved the man as carefully as we could into the back of it, and then drove as quickly as possible to the Böblingen Kreiskrankenhaus, which is a hospital. The victim of the accident wasn't conscious, but from his papers we could ascertain his address and that, tragically, he was the father of 7 children. The hospital tried hard to save him, but despite some huge blood transfusion, he died before I could visit the hospital again. It was another very sad experience for me and another lesson on how apparently unfair life can be. Right away, questions were asked about why such exercises were necessary and why I had chosen to conduct one so close to my parents' home. Nothing was said directly, but the inference was that it had been my fault again. Another triumph for the Nachrichtenzug. When my statement was examined, it was decided to take Meyer for observation in a mental health clinic. The findings were that he had apparently had a very hard upbringing and education as a boy, and this caused him, upon occasion, to lapse into a semi-unconscious state of reverie, fixating on some aspect of his severe early life. The court accepted this and decided that punishment would not be appropriate, but for safety's sake, he should not drive anymore. For my part, I tried to represent my own case to be able to drive myself. I had, in the past, argued that my position wasn't like any other lieutenants in the Gruppe and I needed freedom of movement, but the military mind is slow to yield to changes, and particularly when this might become a precedent. It took another accident at Bonn-Hangela, when I was nearly killed, to get affirmation that I could, in future, look after my own safety. In spite of these incidents, we were determined to continue our radio testing. The main objective was to improve the coordination between the units, to weld them into one cohesive communication service. The mobile group had to work in unison or it didn't work at all. All 3 of the heavy units depended upon each other for something. The transmitter truck was no use without a radio mast vehicle, and neither of those could operate without a generator. Power was always a problem, and it would have been of great help if we could have drawn on the mains, but however ingeniously the operators tried, they could not achieve a successful hookup with the public circuit. We thought we got it right once, but that only resulted in one of the 1.5 kilowatt sets being sent back to the Siemens factory for repair. After that, we resorted to the tried and tested, only running on the generator motor. Problems with the evolution of communications were everywhere. It was a continuous process of invention and initiative, and this is where we hit one of the key difficulties again. To sustain the motivation that is required to overcome adversity and to stimulate initiative, there has to be the will, or at least a reason, to succeed. At squadron level, there was no such initiative, and it was always an uphill struggle to get any help. The radio mechanics had very little experience and looked for guidance to their squadron leaders and from the Werkmeisters. These senior technicians often had no enthusiasm at all, and all too often the problem was left unresolved, and with a shrug of the shoulders, another radio was shelved until they could fix it. Typical of these problems was the difficulty in simply fitting a set to an aircraft. The 109s had provision for radio equipment built into them with electrical connections through the main wiring loom and fittings to hold the set in the fuselage midway between the cockpit and the tail. Right away, we had a 3-way problem. There was a plug board to take the electrical connections so that the radios could be changed easily. The trouble was that the Dora and the Emil had different connections. A radio might fit one of the Doras, but it would not fit any of the Emils and vice versa. Some radios wouldn't fit either, and some would match the mechanical fixings, but none of the plugs on the board. It was too easy for the mechanics just to give up, and that was, I suppose, understandable, for even when we had these sets fitted, as I did in No. 3 Squadron, the tuning was an absolute nightmare. The tuning of the crystals had to be so fine and one set could not be changed in the air. Batteries were another complication. Whilst we were working, we had to hook up spare batteries so as not to drain the aircraft's accumulator, particularly whilst transmitting. These had to be kept charged and carried out to where they were needed, then hooked into the aircraft's circuit. It was all very messy and all too easy to leave for more important matters. It was hard work and a constant nightmare for me. I often felt desperate with no help and practically nothing going right. However, on reflection, it was good training for the strain that was to come. One source of relief was gunnery practice, and most of us looked forward to this. It was a chance to fly under telling conditions and to release the awesome destructive power of the fighter. A lot of my rage and frustration was worked out on the innocent targets on the range. We used either Schleißheim near Munich or Schwäbisch Hall. The latter was favorite for us because we could reach it easily from Böblingen, but Schleißheim required a landing at Munich before the exercise. It was at a gunnery exercise where Hinnerk Waller and I once really created a problem for our squadron leader Helmut Kühle, causing him to consider disciplinary action against us. A training shoot was made on targets which were 3 meters square. To attack these, our two fuselage-mounted 7.9mm Rheinmetall Borsig MG-17 machine guns were each loaded with a belt of only 50 rounds. Full magazines provided exactly 1000 rounds for each gun in the E and 500 rounds per gun in the D model. The object of this exercise was to teach selective shooting and to encourage the pilots to fire in short bursts to conserve their ammunition. 5 approaches were to be made, ideally firing 10 rounds from each gun on each approach. For this, we were using the older Doras not only because they were virtually obsolete, but because it was easier for the armorers to adjust the machine gun interrupter mechanism for the 2-blade prop rather than the big 3-blader on the Emil, which was more crucial and still at the training stage for many of them. In the air, our experience had shown that there was a certain harmonious sympathy between the guns and the rate at which the propeller was turning. At around 1800 RPM, the guns fired nicely, but much faster or slower, and they were made to stutter by the interrupter unit. We had yet to work out this ideal with the Emil. In many respects, it was still a very new aircraft. The routine was to approach the targets under power at about 200 meters altitude and then reduce the RPM to 1800 ready for firing. The aircraft would settle in a stable glide and we would line up the Revi gun sight and pull the trigger as the target came to bear. There were strict instructions not to go below 50 meters because some pilots had flown right into the targets or hit the ground after their pass, and here was the problem. The lower you flew, the better your line you had on your target by reducing the deflection caused by too much altitude. To be sure of a maximum score, it was an advantage to be as close to inline with the target as possible, and this might mean gliding down to ground zero, in contravention of the standing orders. To try to curb the enthusiasm of the pilots, we would always have an observer near to the targets to report back whenever necessary. I wanted to do well with my gunnery. Maybe I felt that I had to offset some of the negativity which seemed to follow me on the ground. In any event, I had, in my enthusiasm to excel, flown very low but had achieved a near-perfect score. I had rationed my ammunition correctly for the 5 passes and had recorded 97 hits out of 100. That, I thought, made up for a lot. Kühle wasn't so keen on the result and questioned me closely about my altitude on the approach. I was a little indignant and asked him to call Lieutenant Waller in the observation booth. He did, with nothing unusual being reported by my faithful friend. However, my little triumph didn't last long, as a mechanic who was reloading the magazines reported that the radiator of my aircraft was leaking. The Dora had the one big radiator centrally located under the chin of the fuselage, whereas the later Emil had 2 radiators, one under each wing. Kühle came with me to inspect the problem, and the reason for the leak was obvious. Inside the cowling and in the fins of the radiator matrix were small pieces of gravel, which had been thrown up by the impact of the bullets, as I had almost clipped the ground after passing the target. The damage wasn't too bad, so I was able to fly back to Böblingen, but later Hinnerk and I were treated to a royal dressing down by Kühle, who accused us of conspiracy and falsehood. That was a bit hard because it hadn't been premeditated, it had just been that Hinnerk had seen my success and was loath to ruin it for his friend. Unfortunately, Kühle was a stickler for the rules and it wouldn't be the last time that I'd be in trouble by virtue of this. We only attended the ground shoot 4 times because of the logistical problems of getting to Schleißheim and because the ranges at Schwäbisch Hall were being used more and more by the bombers. This had an advantage for me which wasn't immediately obvious. My role as Nachrichtenoffizier was now being accepted and with my NCOs well trained, I was available for other duties. This soon brought me another title, Flugleitungsoffizier. Amongst other duties, I had to liaise with Lufthansa to draw up contingency plans for emergency landings and similar events in the Stuttgart area. But the real advantage of my new position was that I had standing permission for unlimited low flying to locate a possible site for gunnery practice, which would be for the exclusive use of the first group of Fighter Group 52. At last I had some freedom to fly, as I'd always wanted to ever since I had first sat in a 109, and I took advantage of it. I can't say that I flew the aircraft to its limit, but I certainly flew it to mine, up to the line of the Alp and plunging down past the grey volcanic cliffs into the Neckar Valley, over the three-lined ridges, clipping their apexes, and hurtling low over the small villages on the Alp where I had grown up. For as long as I could justify it, I immersed myself in the sheer joy of flying that machine in the way I had always wanted. It is a memory of my days as a pilot that is still one of the most vivid and treasured. For my low-flying forays, there were ample Doras available, but the Emils were being kept in strict reserve. Only as many hours as were needed for familiarization were permitted on the E's, and they were otherwise kept in a state of readiness in case of so-called emergencies. There was constant talk of a military solution to our territorial disputes, and more the name of Poland was spoken. The media gave increasing coverage of atrocities being committed on German so-called immigrants in Poland, and it was hard not to think of war when you saw that your fellow countrymen were being so badly treated. But before these events were to conspire to overtake us, there were two significant maneuvers to be undertaken. The first was to transfer the whole Gruppe to Wengeohr in the Eifel, and this, for the Nachrichtenzug, would be our first real test. Because of my other duties involved with the move, I couldn't fly in and went with half of my troops in the mobile unit, going ahead and setting up our communications, just as we would in battle. It was exactly what we had prepared for. We were on site first, and setting up one of our transmitter stations and hooking into telephones went like a well-practiced exercise it was. One thing caused me doubts, but that was nothing to do with my unit. The prescribed landing strip was very soft, and I tried to make contact with base to advise them to land where we had set up a directional landing tee with white linen. However, the message didn't reach the pilots, and the first aircraft to arrive didn't have a radio to receive landing instructions anyway. He came in as he'd been briefed before departure, and, as predicted, his main wheels sank in, fortunately doing no more damage than standing the aircraft on its nose. Most of the rest had radios, and we were able to relay the problem to them and detail a landing where the ground was firmer. It was a small triumph for the Nachrichtenzug. Not only had the mobile unit arrived and set up successfully whilst our colleagues maintained the base comms, but we had also to a large degree averted more damage and possible fatalities by having clear ground-to-air communications. We were pleased with the result, but it would have been foolish to make too much of it within the Gruppe. The joys of peacetime operations and training. But we'll get to that shortly. First, you've heard it. Ulrich mentioned cider in his tale. What he probably means is Apfelwein, or as the locals in this region call it, Ebelwoi. So, welcome to Kitchen Diaries. Apfelwein, as the name suggests, is wine made from apples, particularly rather sour apples. But the wine itself isn't as sour as you'd think, and you can mix it with sparkling water to create a nice, refreshing beverage that is called a Gespritzler, which literally means a fizzler. It is traditionally served in a so-called ribbed glass, which is called that way because it is ribbed for his pleasure. But be careful, this is something that will guarantee a headache if you overdo it. The wine, that is, not the glass. So let's talk peacetime training. Now, the most fun I've had in the army were these huge exercises like Ulrich describes them. We called them free roam exercises, and they were exactly what you'd expect. I can relate three things. 1. Friendly farmers and old people. When they saw you running around with all your battle rattle on, they'd immediately come outside and offer you snacks, milk or schnapps, which was always welcome, as you might imagine. Some would even address you by rank, which was nice. 2. Operating in the field was way more relaxed than operating inside the garrison. Traditionally, that is how things are done in the German army, so there would be no policing that moustache or some shit. You would just become one with the forest. And finally, number 3, having total autonomy as the leader of a small unit. As you probably know, in Germany we operate mission-based. That is, you'd receive the general idea of High Command and their intentions, some basic objectives and a time frame, and how you'd achieve said objective was totally up to you. This is genius, and it puts young officers to the test. I myself, for example, absolutely loved being the commander of the opposing so-called Red Team. I would instill pure fear into the hearts of the Blue Force. We'd always drive around dressed as pirates, or maybe once naked, except for camouflage paint, and we'd also install loudspeakers on our cars and blast folk music or Barbie Girl all night through the woods at maximum volume. We'd also infiltrate command posts and replace permanent markers and other equipment with dildos. Those were glorious times, I can tell you. And fortunately, we never had any severe accidents, which I thank God for to this day. So, I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next week. Cheers and bye-bye.